Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is The Philosophy of Anxiety, Monkey Mind and Mindful Metaphors. It is always much too close for comfort and, in a sense, gets lodged in one's throat like a choked wad of affect. Or, if the experience has already passed, it fades away so quickly that, like the foggy memory of a confused dream, it slips past one's tongue like an airless hiccup. Brian Robertson. All art and literature, like ritual itself, creates a single determinate form out of the chaos of all possible experience. Richard Seaford. Hi everybody, and this is the first of what I hope will be a long and interesting series on the topic of anxiety. And this will be an overview, so like I said, there will be quite a few more hopefully and videos, and this is to give just to map out the territory. So I apologise in advance if I skim through some things, but I will be returning to them in detail. So I just wanted to try and scope out the general terrain, which means I can't go into too much specific detail each and every time I bring up a concept. But trust me, I will go into it in more depth than you ever want me to. But I've chose, just to get right stuck into it straight away, I've chose these two quotations. The first one, it's in, as you can see, a book about Lacanian psychoanalysis. That's the title, and it's specifically related to Jacques Lacan, an incredibly complex and difficult writer. But he wrote the Seminar 10, I think it was called Anxiety. And Brian Robertson, this is just an example. I think he writes like an absolute angel. And I think he manages to encapsulate the nebulousness, the amorphousness, just the difficulty to pin down exactly what anxiety is. And that, as we'll find out, is part of its nature. It's very difficult to define. It's keenly felt in your stomach almost. You know, your gut. It's often referred to your guts when you feel incredibly anxious. And yet, despite that somatic depth of feeling, your bodily sense of anguish or anxiety or dread, all these synonyms you can use to describe anxiety, yet it's also just evanescent. I'll just keep using synonyms, but this notion like an airless hiccup. Anyway, we'll come back to that, the difficulty of defining a paradoxically intensely felt but very abstract emotion. And then the second quotation, this idea that art and literature is like a form of ritual. And Richard Seaford is a classical scholar at the University of Exeter, and he done a number of books that I find absolutely fascinating, but in this particular one, he emphasises throughout the book how in ancient Greece, ritual played a fundamental, ubiquitous role in everyday life. And it struck me, he links it to art and literature, and one of the major themes of today's talk is that a key aspect of anxiety is a feeling that you've lost your moorings. You're discombobulated is one of my favourite words. You're discombobulated, you're confused, you're distressed. And art and literature, they may not always have happy themes, but the argument will be, and it's been a common thread throughout the channel, that art and literature can help ground you and provide focus. And I'll suggest in various works, in topical literature, so I'm thinking of Jonathan Haidt, for example, The Anxious Generation, and various scientific studies of anxiety, it's quite clear to most people that new social media and lots of modern technologies do not exactly help in creating, or they contribute to creating a very anxious population. And the corollary of that is, in a world full of screens, and I always say this on this channel, but in a world full of screens, and ironically, you're watching this on a screen, but we'll give ourselves a pass. But in a screen-dominated society, great art, great literature tend to fall by the wayside. So I'll be linking some of my arguments that art and literature can be an antidote to anxiety. And to get clear from the get-go, I'll be talking about some quite practical notions of anxiety in terms of how psychologists and psychiatrists understand the notion. But I said it in the title, this is a philosophical examination and exploration of anxiety. So it's not designed to be practical. But I do think the more you delve into it as a topic, the more you're prepared to read around the topic, because it's, ironically, such a nebulous, difficult to pin down topic, and because it doesn't lend itself to ready fixes. I think a deep dive into art and literature and philosophy in the long run might actually help people. But whether it does or not, I just think it's a fascinating topic. But I just didn't want you to come into this expecting any ready answers. The major role for me for philosophy has always been to ask questions, not necessarily to have all the answers. And I just hope I can ask a few interesting questions along the way in relation to anxiety. But anyway, without more ado, the first image. I was going to joke that this was from a Harvard medical textbook training psychiatrists and neuroscientists, but that, what would have been just a little throwaway joke, I think the window in which you can make jokes like that is rapidly diminishing, because I can foresee a time when educational standards have fallen so low that this actually would be in a medical textbook. But it's just to introduce the concept of monkey mind, this idea, as we'll see, about fickleness, and the idea that at the base of the brain, it's just mapping on with vaguely humorous metaphors, the idea that at the base of the brain you've got the most basic evolutionary aspects, the lizard, then you have mammalian responses as you go up into the limbic system, and then the prefrontal cortex, cortex. I just think it always amuses me, this higher porpoise. It's like someone from New Jersey trying to pronounce it. Apologies to any North Americans who are offended by that, but hey-ho. So that the idea is the prefrontal cortex is the more sophisticated part of the brain, in a sense, that delays gratification and shows some hesitation or judgment, whereas the neocortex, this notion of the monkey mind, is where ideas fly around and you can act rather impulsively if you're not careful. You flip from idea to idea. So that's the general idea of monkey mind, and then I'll explain in a minute when we get into the definitions of how its original origin was actually in Buddhist scripture, and it's being borrowed, this idea of monkey mind, by popular psychology. But overall, it's just to express this idea that part of anxiety can be seen as the brain flitting around in an uncontrolled fashion. So the metaphor that's being used is like a monkey, or a simile in that case. But we'll look into that, because I want to redefine the concept of the monkey and look at it from a slightly different angle, but it will all become clear as we go along. So here's the overview that I don't always do this, but I think there are so many conceptual plates being spun in the air. It's why it took me longer than normal to produce this video, because I was trying to get a scope on how it might develop in future as well. So there's an awful lot of reading in various different aspects, and hopefully this little schedule, as I map it out, will provide some extra structure to what could be quite a complex, diverse topic. So I've already alluded to this idea that anxiety has an inherent paradox. It's nebulously abstract and also deeply felt in our guts. It's a very intensely felt emotion, yet simultaneously, as I've said, very difficult to pin down. And particularly in terms of definitions. So we use the word angst. In literature, it's often used in psychology and psychoanalysis, which is a German word. And again, it's difficult to... we use it because we don't have an exactly similar word in English, but roughly it's dread, it's fear, it's anguish, it's all of these things and more. So one definition that I'll look briefly at is the difference between fear and anxiety. Arguably they're different, although I'll claim that in some mostly the scientific literature, I would argue that they don't distinguish adequately enough between fear and anxiety. And the one thing philosophy is very good for is actually exploring how they're different entities and providing a much fuller definition of what anxiety may be. So monkey mind, I will explore in particular with regard to two major thinkers. There's a guy called Hans Blumenberg, German writer from the 20th century, and he has some brilliant ideas about metaphor and this concept of the absolutism of reality. That's what human beings are up against in a way that animals aren't, and I'll explain later about that. And then there's also a guy called Gregory Bateson, who has some fascinating ideas about, you'll see in a second, this notion of an ecology of the mind. So he's seeking ways in which we make sense of the world in ways perhaps that something like a monkey would not. So Kierkegaard and Lacan, and I'm flitting through these, so I'll be looking at all these in more detail, so please don't get worried if I'm skipping over them. So Kierkegaard and Lacan, Søren Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher who was writing around about the 1840s, and he wrote a book on the concept of anxiety. And Jacques Lacan, like I said, Seminar 10 on anxiety. And both of these are fascinating writers because one of the purported differences between fear and anxiety is that fear has an object. It's something specific you tend to be afraid of, whereas anxiety is much less focused, and some people argue it lacks an object. And Kierkegaard and Lacan, in quite complex ways, they offer a different dimension to that idea. They suggest it's not an object that's lacked in the realm of anxiety. It's actually our notion of ourselves as a subject becomes incredibly confused, and we struggle to deal as a unified self with our emotions. So it's not so much anxiety lacks a focused object, it's that we as individuals lack the wherewithal to deal with certain phenomena or emotions, and that creates the anxiety. And they explore that in various complex ways, which I'll try and make sense of for you. And then one of the arguments in future videos I want to go into much more depth on is the idea that if you think of schizophrenia as an extreme example of a mental disorder that nevertheless is on a spectrum, so there are various schizoid autistic traits of which schizophrenia is an extreme example, and they arguably have relevance to modern society as a whole, and everybody, whether you think you're quite sane, everybody is on to some extent a slight spectrum. And the concept of solipsism, one aspect of schizophrenia is that you become self-obsessed, and the world, your relationship to the world becomes mono-focused around you, which is obviously unhealthy. And then simultaneously, you can either feel things too deeply, sensually, reality hits you too hard, or and sometimes in alternating states, you can feel distanced and cut off from reality. So, lots going on there, but schizophrenia actually is a very interesting mental condition that sheds light on the notion of anxiety, because when all this stuff's going on, when you're excessively solipsistic, when you feel things too deeply or not at all, this creates what's been referred to by people like R.D. Laing, a psychiatrist, British psychiatrist, who was in the 60s and 1960s and 70s, was very popular. But he writes about some of these issues and how he talks about ontological anxiety. In other words, you become anxious about the very nature of your own being, which sounds dramatic, but he has lots of great examples of that. And then this all leads to what I think is a lovely phrase that Louis Sass uses in his book, Madness and Modernism. And it's called rampant subjectivism. In other words, it links to this idea of solipsism, the idea that the world revolves around you. And of course, that has potential links to things like narcissistic personality disorder. But rampant subjectivism, the idea that we have a subjective interpretation of the world that we rely upon and value, overvalue, arguably, that has philosophical roots that I'm going to look at. So there's a guy called Johann Gottlieb Fichte. I just like saying it because with a Scouse accent it's relatively easy. But he was a German philosopher that prefigured people like Kierkegaard and Hegel. And I'll give you little examples, but German idealist philosophy in the 1800s engaged in a very systematic and deep way with notions of individuality and subjectivity, and their legacy is still being felt today because a lot of scientific methodology and some types of philosophy that have leached into the popular culture have been affected by this notion that we are, like Descartes, I think therefore I am, you are the centre of the universe, but I'll go into that in more depth. So then to begin to look at, towards the end, I begin to look at possible solutions or more constructive ways to think about anxiety. And a brilliant thinker, but very odd in the sense that he started life off as an anthropologist. Eventually he became interested in cybernetics and systems thinking. He was involved in research into psychiatric issues, again with schizophrenia. So Gregory Bateson wrote this book, Steps Towards an Ecology of the Mind. And he pays particular attention to metaphors and how they help to structure communication. So one thing you find in all of this is that metaphors can be misunderstood by people with certain mental disorders. So metaphors are just one of a raft of communicational devices we use that help people realize what register of communication we're using. So think of it in a way, if you're chatting to someone and they've got a raised eyebrow, or I'm speaking and 99% of the time I'm being sarcastic, there are subtle cues when we communicate that people with certain mental disorders like schizophrenia or autism struggle to identify. And at a broader social level, part of my argument is that metaphors can be part of that. And because our society has become less and less literate and used to literature and art and registers of communication, the subtleties, then our ecology has suffered. If you think of the mind in terms of an ecological organism and its relationship to the environment. And later on, he has this wonderful idea of the double bind, which is, it's almost like a catch-22. He uses it to describe the way family dynamics work, so that you're given mixed messages by a powerful family member, let's say your mother or father. You're given mixed messages, and you can't, typically if you're a child, you can't work your way out of the contradiction because the messages you're being given are contradictory, and it'll be an overarching unspoken rule or law like don't disobey your parents or respect your parents that make it difficult to see a way out of the problem. And I'll go into much more depth. I'm going to probably do a whole video on that. But the concept of the double bind is a really interesting notion. And again, that leads, if you're a little kid in a family situation who's suffering under a double bind, mixed messages and no way out, that obviously leads to anxiety. And again, at a social level, I, at a future date, will examine how arguably there are mixed messages in the world around us today in terms of ideology. And the way out is not clear, and that creates anxiety amongst people. But I will go into that in much more depth. And then just to bring it all back to that initial quote from Richard Seaford, philosophy and art can be ritualistic antidotes because they provide the structure, the stability, and as ritual implies, the regularity that anxiety often lacks. So it's an awful lot, and like I say, there'll be future videos looking at all of these issues in more depth, but I hope you get, even if it's slightly difficult to follow, and there's an awful lot there, I hope you get a sense of how these ideas relate to each other and build upon each other and show different facets of the notion of anxiety. So, having said that, the difficulty of just defining anxiety, it's not easy. So these are just basic dictionary definitions that I'm offering. Emotional turmoil, painful sadness. A feeling of acute but vague anxiety or apprehension, often accompanied by depression, especially philosophical anxiety. So that's interesting, the idea of philosophical anxiety. And I'll be arguing as we go along that actually philosophy is anxiety-inducing to some extent, because philosophy is always asking questions. A bit like the annoying kid, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Or the little kid saying to their parents, why? Well, that's a little bit, if you think of philosophy as a really annoying 6 or 7 year old. So in that sense, philosophy exacerbates anxiety, but thought of in another way, it's when you confront anxiety head on, philosophy is the perfect tool sometimes, because it speaks the same language as anxiety. But these are just the etymology. Some of these are the roots where the word anxiety comes from. And when I did some research into this, what surprised me was the connotation of narrowness and constriction, which is a theme. I'll give you some examples from Francis Bacon paintings. But the idea of being squeezed, throttled, constricted, the narrowness, I think this is an important theme underlining aspects of anxiety. So, again on the definitions, I sounded like a Jewish grandmother then. Again, with the definitions. But the Diagnostic Manual of Psychiatry, so the DSM-5 as it's routinely referred to. Fear is defined as the emotional response to real or perceived imminent threat, whereas anxiety is the anticipation of future threat. So this is from the DSM-5. And I'm going to suggest that this has quite profound limitations as a definition. So the emotional response to real or perceived imminent threat, where anxiety is the anticipation of future threat. I'm going to argue that throughout this and future videos, that anxiety is actually much deeper than this. And this, I'd suggest, is part of the problem with the diagnostic manual. You know, people aren't cars. There isn't a manual or a vacuum cleaner. Yes, it's helpful sometimes to categorize and to put things systematically together. But I just have this, and maybe I need therapy, I just have this reaction to the idea that you can just systematically define various human ailments in the way that the DSM-5 tries to. But that's just not my knee-jerk reaction. I will try and show you as we go along how this definition is insufficient. I don't think it works with anxiety. So this is, I think his first name was Joseph Ledoux, an American psychiatrist or neuroscientist. He wrote this book, Anxious, The Modern Mind in the Age of Anxiety, from a scientific point of view. If the initial state is triggered by a specific stimulus, it is a state of fear. However, when the state in question involves worry about something that is not present and may never occur, then the state is anxiety. And again, you can see how this links to the DSM-5 definition. I won't dwell on this, but I just wanted to give you a little idea of why I think this is insufficient. So Ledoux uses the example, I think he talks about if you're on the New York subway and you see a suspicious package, you might be anxious about that because it may, let's say it isn't a bomb, and the vast majority of the time it isn't. He's saying because it's not actually a bomb is not actually present and an explosion is not going to occur, you're being anxious when you see the package rather than fearful, because you'd be fearful if you knew it was a bomb. And I don't buy that distinction. So one of the reasons is I'm old enough to remember on the British mainland, the IRA were bombing for decades. And I remember being in a pub when I left my briefcase to go to the bar after work, and I was asked to move I went on the public announcement system, could someone please claim the bag immediately, because the pub was very close to a BBC studio. So if it was a security risk, a potential target. Now, in that type of scenario, I'd suggest I don't think it's irrational or unfounded anxiety to be not even hypersensitive, to be very cautious in a context where bombs are going off. So just because it may not be a bomb and just because an explosion may not happen, I would associate it much more with a rational fear as opposed to irrational, unfounded, vague anxiety. And this is a definitional tension that I'll explore in much more depth, but I do think this is how philosophy differs from these more scientific, psychiatric-driven definitions of anxiety. I think philosophical definitions are actually much richer. But just to give you an example of, and I don't think I've done that justice, and I'm going to look at Ledoux's work in more detail, along with works like Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist, who wrote a book called The Anxious Generation about the effects of anxiety and modern media on young people specifically. So I will look at these non-philosophical, more science-based approaches in more detail. I don't want to be accused of misrepresenting them, but I'm just giving you these little excerpts to point to just the beginnings of why there may be a major disagreement between science and philosophy and how they approach this quite differently. But anyway, I wanted to show you an art piece now to try and illustrate some of this and to see what you make of it. I've shown it before when I did a video on German expressionism, but most of you probably haven't seen it. So just have a close look and then I'll explain why I think it's relevant. Now, this is a painting by a German artist called Max Radler, and it was painted in 1933, and it was just called Station SD2, as you can see on the sign. And why it affects me, like that original quote, the wad of affect that Brian Robertson refers to in the epigraph right at the beginning of the video. I totally acknowledge this may be unduly affected, you know, when they say hindsight is a perfect science. Knowing what we now know about the role of the railways in the Holocaust, that knowledge would not have been available to anyone looking at this painting in 1933. So why I think it affects me is a combination of things. One is the emptiness of the horizon, and I'm going to talk about that very soon. So please bear that in mind, the emptiness, the distance involved, just looking out on the empty horizon, the emptiness of the sky. And just the intimation, a man in a uniform, the clockwork nature, there's clock there, the lines, the geometric lines of the train. And like I say, the trains played a crucial role in the transportation of people to the death camps. So I'd suggest this painting contains certain presentiments of dread that even the artist may not have been fully aware of, but it's almost, I think Marshall McLuhan, I always say, refers to artists having a great sense of sense ratios. They get what's in the air much earlier than most people. So I can't look at this without thinking it wasn't a specific fear this artist had or is representing here. It was a much more abstract dread. And that's just one little example of why I think art, in this case, but also literature, can provide a handle, it can provide a form for understanding anxiety. And then, because I am a nerdy ex-academic, these are the actual origin. I wanted to know what the origins of the phrase monkey mind is used in popular psychology. But it's, as I said at the beginning, it's taken from Buddhist scripture. So this is the Sanskrit. I'm assuming it's Kapi Chita or Sita. Forgive me for not knowing how to pronounce it. But Pali is an ancient scriptural language related to Sanskrit, in which some of the Buddhist scriptures were written. So it's a compound word, monkey-minded, and it's used to refer to being fickle. So this is one of the scriptural references. I shall establish the fickle ones in the noble path. I was thinking of adopting this as the motto for the channel. Get my good mate Richard Grannon to read it in his chocolatey tones at the beginning of every single video, perhaps. And then in Chinese and Japanese, in the Buddhist traditions, there's this notion of monkey of the mind, horse of the will. And these are the various connotations monkey-mindedness has. And I'm just giving you there the Chinese and Japanese. They're reversible. And it's interesting, the horse of the will, because it's in, I'm trying to remember, Plato, Phaedrus. He talks about a charioteer, the mind being like a charioteer. And there's a black horse and a white horse, and the black horse is pulling the chariot and it's out of control and badly behaved, and the white horse is much better trained. So this is approximately 350 BC, and he's talking in terms that aren't a million miles from Freud's notion of the id, the ego, and the superego, but also the Buddhist notion of horse of the will, this idea that the will could be like a horse. Just strikes me as quite interesting, the parallels. And these are just some further scriptural references. Just as a monkey swinging through a forest wilderness grabs a branch, letting go of it, it grabs another branch, letting go of that, it grabs another one. Letting go of that, it grabs another one. In the same way, what's called mind, intellect, or consciousness, by day and by night, arises as one thing and ceases as another. Having left a former object, they attach themselves to another. Dominated by craving, they do not go beyond attachment. They reject and seize, like a monkey, letting go of a branch to take hold of another. So just, like I say, because I am pedantic and like to know the origins of absolutely everything, these are some of the earliest Buddhist references to the concept of monkey-mindedness. But this is where I want to show you a different angle. And this is where I'm borrowing from Hans Blumenberg's idea. But just suppose that this is before we evolved from apes. Let's pretend I'm a big fat monkey sitting in one of those creepers with a massive pile of bananas next to me. In that sense, it doesn't really matter. We use the metaphor of monkey mind as being uncontrolled. But in that type of environment, that's a monkey's natural environment. So I just want to unpack, unusually for me, I'm taking a metaphor and interpreting it quite literally. But this is the biological niche in which monkeys would exist. And if you're threatened in this environment, there's fight or flight, and they're only your real two options. So it's quite a self-enclosed environment for which you are biologically adapted. And then this is just a depiction of, in every species there's always a curious bugger. So on the edge of the jungle, there's more space and there's the beginning of the horizon. And then you get to the savannah, which is all horizon. Remember when I was talking about the Max Radler painting? Why I find it slightly disconcerting. Well, when we, in evolutionary terms, left the jungle, this is what we encountered. The almost limitless horizon. And rather than fight or flight, suddenly you've got a whole new range of problems. There are many more opportunities in this open environment, but many more dangers that you can't see coming over the horizon until it's too late, potentially. So you have a whole different set of adaptive responses required that go beyond mere fight or flight. And then you get Harry the hairy caveman. He's got massive toes. And he decides to, I'm assuming, I don't want to offend anyone, but that's a bloke ape. But he decides to saunter off as we become bipedal, in other words, two-legged creatures. And this is when our relationship to the horizon changes fundamentally. So suddenly we're in the savannah. And this is early humanoids. And arguably, he wrote a book, Hans Blumenberg, called Work on Myth, which is stunning, and I want to do a whole video on it, if not more than one video. But he has this beautiful phrase, the absolutism of reality. And I've added bipedal angst. The minute we go onto two legs, rather than living in a biological niche that we're used to adapting to, suddenly you have the absolutism of reality staring you in the face, so to speak. This horizon of distance. Reality suddenly becomes almost an entity in and of itself. So this is from the translator's introduction. And for the life of me, I can't remember the translator's name, so apologies. I'm lousy with names. It's advanced senility setting in. But anyway, the dramatically enlarged horizon of what they could perceive and within which they could be perceived, would be for them a situation of great ambiguity, one in which some of their central instincts, such as fleeing from immediate danger, an instinct that had served to clarify many situations for them in the forest, would be of little help. Our ancestors came close to not having control of the conditions of their existence because they had become, as we remain, a species without a clearly defined biological niche. So this is a summary from the translator of Blumenberg's key idea on the absolutism of reality. And what he's suggesting is, it's great that we came down from the trees. That's what makes us humans rather than apes. The downside is, according to this notion of how evolution affects us psychologically, the minute you leave your clearly defined biological niche, guess what? Anxiety comes along with that. So immediately, from this perspective, you're not escaping anxiety. It's part of the human condition. And again, to put this in visual terms, remember the definition of anxiety as constriction, narrowness. I'm just bringing together the notion of the human ape in a constricted form. As this is, I would suggest, Francis Bacon's contribution to a pictorial representation of anxiety. And it's difficult to look at this if you're British, and I have a memory of Johnny Vegas, the comedian, doing adverts for PG Tips, tea bags. Monkey! But I fear I don't do Bacon's art justice with that reference. So just to start giving some other, widening the notion, so Søren Kierkegaard, Danish theologian, philosopher, his interpretation, and he's writing, like I say, roughly various works, but around about the 1840s, the idea that for him anxiety comes from freedom, and because he's thinking of it in theological terms, original sin. So again, in future, it would be great to do, not for religious reasons, in case any of you are worried, I'm not trying to proselytize, but the things like the book of Genesis in the Old Testament, the notion that we left the Garden of Eden, you should be able to see how that has parallels with this idea of leaving the jungle and going on to the savannah. The way it's described in the book of Genesis, that you're obviously in some type of safety in the Garden of Eden, God's got your back, nothing to worry about, no sense of shame, you're just naked as a jaybird, so to speak, and no worries whatsoever. And the minute the apple from the tree of knowledge is eaten, there is a life of toil and tears as humankind has to go out from the garden. But in terms of, if you think about it, without that exit into the outside, then we're not fully human, if that makes sense, because I've forgotten who said it. I came across this phrase, humans are neither angels nor beasts. So in the Garden of Eden, angels have no human feelings or sensibilities because they have nothing to worry about. They live in the fullness of God's, every day is an angelic, cherubic, hooray. But that's not what it is to be human. Likewise, beasts, as far as we know, at least my dogs, live in the moment. waggy waggy. As long as they're fed and loved, they lead pretty much unreflective, ecstatic little lives. Again, that's not what it is to be human. So anxiety comes from freedom, and then it has added components. So you fear that you're not leading an authentic life. You're not being true to yourself, because freedom brings choices. You then worry, are your choices valid? Are they authentic? Are you living your best life? Then you feel guilty. If you're not making the best of your life, you may look back at your past parts of your life and feel anxious that you've not made the most of your life. That creates anxiety. I'm depressing myself now. But all of these, according to Kierkegaard, these aspects of anxiety are an intrinsic part of what it is to be a human being. And like I said, I'll look at Kierkegaard in detail, but he is a difficult read. But he has common, phrases like this: anxiety is the reality of freedom as a potentiality before this freedom has materialized. So if philosophers gave each other Christmas crackers, this would be what you'd read in one of them. But anyway, I'll explain at a future date. I think I've given an overview of what Kierkegaard's all about, at least. But one aspect is this German phrase, das Man, the idea that it goes to the notion of authenticity and inauthenticity. Das Man just means, in an English translation, might be average Joe. Or in English, there's a phrase, the man on the Clapham omnibus. Modern society encourages, to some extent, the average and standardized behavior. And that can be a source of anxiety because it relates to this notion of authenticity. And looking as a complete technophobe from the outside at things like the phenomenon of online influencers, it strikes me as paradoxically worrying that people who seem to have so little to emulate become what are called influencers. But that presupposes people are in need of people to influence them. And I would just suggest, without getting too cynical, the quality of some of the people influencing people these days is not what it might have been in the past. But anyway, all these things relate to the freedom to choose. And with it comes, in its train, various forms of anxiety based upon this triad of freedom, authenticity, and guilt. And then ideology. So given all this freedom of choice, we live in, I think, whatever your politics, right or left, I think most people would accept that nowadays we live in quite profoundly ideological times in which people do not deviate from their presuppositions and their worldview. And arguably that is a sign of the times, because people are in this realm of freedom, but fear inauthenticity and fear guilt. They're anxious. So they latch onto ideology as a form of certainty and a way of a shortcut to virtue. So there's the very common phrase now, virtue signalling. And these are ideas, like I say, that I'll explore. Now, one aspect of anxiety that I referred to in reference to both Kierkegaard I've just spoken about, but also Jacques Lacan, is this all-enveloping dissolution of self. And it's seen in its most extreme form, as I said earlier, in the case of schizophrenia. But looking at extreme mental disorders is useful because, as I said, if we're on a spectrum, if everybody is on some type of spectrum, and schizophrenia is at the extreme end of a spectrum, there are useful cues to how otherwise healthy people might also experience anxiety, just not to such an extreme degree. So this is Rollo May, who wrote a book called The Meaning of Anxiety. He was a psychologist. In greater or lesser degree, anxiety overwhelms the person's discovery of being, blots out the sense of time, dulls the memory of the past and erases the future, which is perhaps the most compelling proof of the fact that it attacks the centre of one's being. While we are subject to anxiety, we are to that extent unable to conceive in imagination how existence would be outside the anxiety. This is why anxiety is so hard to bear, and why people will choose, if they have the chance, severe physical pain, which would appear to the outside observer much worse. So there's various ideas to unpack here. But one is our relationship to the past, present and future. And this is why I'm obsessed. In other videos I've done, I've looked at Proust's À la recherche de temps perdu. Excuse me. And in a certain sense, Proust's magnum opus, this beautiful novel, In Search of Lost Time, as the name implies, it's got an anxious tone all the way through. As Marcel, the narrator, deals with his memories and his life, and he is quite an anxious child. He's at the very beginning of the novel, he's waiting for his mother to come up and give him a goodnight kiss. And by the word of those times probably would have been, he's quite neurasthenic, he's quite neurotic. But the whole book is a beautiful panegyric to the notion of our relationship to time, both how we think of it voluntarily and how it has involuntary effects on us. And in that sense, again, art helps you not be too anxious, because you realise if you read Proust that a certain level of anxiety is par for the course. It's how we relate to time as temporal human beings. You can't escape it. But when you lose your moorings, which is a theme I want to develop, the bit that I've emboldened there, we are to that extent unable to conceive in imagination how existence would be outside the anxiety. So this is, remember the concept of constriction, the idea that anxiety is this narrowness. So I would suggest this backs up the idea that art and literature, insofar as it provides fuel for the imagination, is a way of imagining your way out of the constriction. And it goes on, this is why anxiety is so hard to bear and why people choose, if they have the chance, severe physical pain, which would appear to the outside observer much worse. And I think elsewhere, Rollo May gives the example of, let's say you're at the dentist, and lots of people are fearful of needles at the dentist being anaesthetised, or the drill as it appears over the horizon aimed at your mouth. But at least once the pain is over or the anaesthetic takes effect, there's not a lot to worry about. But compare that to, Rollo May gives the example of, you're walking down the street and you see a neighbour or a friend on the other side of the street, and you're not sure, but you think they may have either ignored you or given you a funny look. Now, that's not like the dentist. That doesn't cause you sharp pain. But that might keep you up for the next 3 or 4 nights if you don't get the chance to sort it out straight away. It might nag and gnaw away at you. And in that sense, anxiety is quite different to short, sharp pain. And again, that's why I'd suggest art in its various forms can help with this. So just to give a practical example, this is actually the illustration to the paperback edition of Jacques Lacan's Seminar 10 on anxiety. And it's a Möbius strip. It's this geometric shape that turns back in on itself. So it's basically a symbol for, the eternal looping around. And inside it's got termites. So I'd suggest that level of representation in visual form, in certain sense, provides an embodiment for anxiety. It provides a form. which personally I think can only be helpful. But then I'm always one who tends to confront things rather than evade them. Maybe that's not for everyone. But again, Brian Robertson here, I just love the way he expresses himself. In stark contrast with fear, anxiety always emerges in the form of a knot with a great deal more tangle and twist to it, something much closer to an exasperating and insoluble riddle than to a terrible, fascinating chimera. And again, this idea of a tangle and a twist, if you read A la Recherche Tombouctou in Search of Lost Time, it's a tangled, twisting, massive shaggy dog story almost of one person's subjective experience of time. But it turns it into an aesthetic form that makes you appreciate the upside, if there is one, of anxiety, the level of creativity and its contribution to basic human experience. So I did say I'd mention, coming towards the end now, but the idea of schizophrenia as the roots. And I've put a link in the description to a short, I think a 15-minute or so video I did on linking Van Gogh's painting of tree roots to excerpts from Sartre's novel La Nausée, Nausea, because I think it's directly applicable to this. But this idea of solipsism, the idea that you are the centre of the universe, but simultaneously, despite the fact you have these delusions of grandeur and the whole universe revolves around you, you also feel yourself dissolving. So this is from the autobiography of a schizophrenic girl. So it's the actual memoirs. I think she was called Renée. I remained quiet, unmoving, my gaze fixed on a spot or a gleam of light. But behind this wall of indifference, suddenly a wave of anxiety would come over me. The anxiety of unreality. My perception of the world seemed to sharpen the sense of the strangeness of things. In the silence and the immensity, each object was cut off by a knife, detached in the emptiness, in the boundlessness, spaced off from other things, without any relationship with the environment. Just by being itself, it came to life. It was there, facing me, terrifying me. So this is, like I say, the actual experience of a girl who was suffering from schizophrenia. But in the silence and the immensity, each object was cut off by a knife, detached in the emptiness. If you can remember that phrase and have it in your head when you see the next image, which I've shown before in a different video, looking at the virtual reality of narcissism was the video, if you want to check it out. But this is during the Renaissance, the rediscovery of linear perspective. And I would suggest this is the cultural roots, this represents the cultural roots of the way in which objects were cut out of the world, as was just previously described. Each object was cut off by a knife, detached in the emptiness, in the boundlessness, spaced off from other things. Well, this is how perspective turns the world into a geometric container of space. And I'd suggest over-reliance upon this way of seeing the world, which is, like I say, geometric and scientific, quantifiable. This is not how good art, good literature, good paintings have much more complex relationship to the environment than this. So I'm suggesting this has a relationship to what Renee, the girl suffering from schizophrenia, is to some extent describing. So that leads to this notion of rampant subjectivism. And Louis Sass, I think it is describing, I shouldn't laugh, but this Johann Gottlieb Fichte, his vocation of man, and I've referred to him here as Kant on steroids, but this gives you a sense of, he was a serious philosopher. And I won't bore you now, but I think I will bore you in future by going into some depth about the German idealist philosophy was all about our conceptualization of the world from a subjective transcendental interpretation. So the individual transcends reality by conceptualizing how the world around them is from their unique subjective point of view, and by the sheer conceptual power of the individual subject. So without wittering on, this is his description. This is Louis Sass describing Fichte's vocation of man. And I won't tell you what it makes me think of until you've read it and see whether there's any parallels with your thoughts. So all knowledge is, and remember this is Louis Sass summarizing Fichte's point of view. All knowledge is but pictures, representations, declares Spirit, a primary speaker in Fichte's book. In fact, there is no material, since it arises only through knowledge. And to realize these truths is, according to Spirit, no longer to tremble at a necessity which exists only in thine own thought, or fear to be crushed by things which are the product of thine own mind. Then shall my powers, determined by and subject to the dominion of my will, invade the external world. I will be the lord of nature, and she shall be my servant. So why I'm providing you with this quotation is, this was a German idealist philosopher who influenced and was a contemporary, from memory, of Hegel, and is part of the tradition stemming from someone like Immanuel Kant. And it may seem a long stretch, but these were theorists of the individual subjective conceptualization of the world. And this type of German idealist philosophy proved highly influential upon Western culture. So just off the top of my head, Hegel, and I think, am I right in thinking, I think Fichte was the person who, the notion of the dialectic is falsely attributed to Hegel. I think it was actually Fichte who had this idea of, you have a thesis, an idea, you have an antithesis, its opposite, and the combination of the two produces the synthesis. And Marx took that idea and ran with it. Boy, did he run with it. But this is just, I'm giving you examples of how, if you read this, this made me think, if an AI, and I'm glad I won't be around to see it when they finally do take over, but if an AI was writing a manifesto, this is probably how it would sound if the AI was called Spirit. This idea that the individual self can be so divorced from the world, or the world in this perspective depends upon the individual for its existence, rather than the individual and the world existing in some type of healthy cohabitation. This rampant subjectivism, I need to go into a lot more and explain it a lot more clearly, but I'm just suggesting way back in 1800, some of the narcissistic tendencies that you see in modern society Remember in the welcome video, I keep referring back to this quote from Robert Conquest, the idea that culture grasps at us with 1,000 invisible fingers. So it may be 1800, but this type of conceptualization of the world has had a profound effect on how Western society has developed. But anyway, to finish with some more positive ideas, I mentioned the idea of an ecology of the mind. Gregory Bateson, the full title of the book was called Steps Towards an Ecology of Mind. And these are just references from his ideas. I've spoken about the absolutism of reality. So when we as apes finally get on two legs and go off to the edge of the savannah and we see the horizon, we're suddenly confronted by, and that's what gives rise to that previous quote from Fichte. That's a German idealist philosopher in the 1800s confronting the absolutism of reality, in other words, the horizon. You know, I've shown the picture from Max Radler of the train station. I've shown you the horizon of the savannah. And German idealist philosophy dealt with the notion of transcendence, how to think of the world in purely conceptual terms. The German idealist philosophers were responding to this absolutism of reality. But in Bateson's work, so that it's Blumenberg's original notion, the absolutism of reality, but Bateson, his whole oeuvre was about trying to find a working compromise rather than resort to the rampant subjectivism of someone like Fichte. And he had this, I'll quickly just mention this notion of the Darwinism of words. I've been banging my head with certain people when I've done online discussions or debates about the role of science. And art and literature always seem to be poor cousins to, you know, the dominance of science. But Bateson has this lovely idea, the Darwinism of words. I'm sorry, I think I'm getting confused. I think this is Blumenberg. But it relates to Bateson's ecology of mind. The Darwinism of words is the extent to which great literature and myths survive, and their condensed wisdom that survive generation after generation after generation, like a Darwinian selection process. So both the absolutism of reality and the survival of words, art, certain narratives, certain myths, this is Blumenberg's notion, both of them. But they contribute to, I think they provide a brilliant context to Bateson's idea of the ecology of mind. And specifically, Bateson has this idea, it's schismogenesis, which sounds a mouthful, but it's basically just the notion that conflict and culture go hand in hand, but ritual and metaphor are ways of structuring human interactions so that you don't have conflict. They internalize the conflict and provide it in ritual form. So again, Blumenberg's idea of absolutism of reality and Darwinism of words, it fits to me with Bateson's idea of schismogenesis, the creation of conflict that means, and ritual and metaphor are ways of controlling it. And then paradox and context, part of the anxiety. So what I'm saying is, if you don't have ritual and metaphor, if you allow yourself to be subject to the absolutism of reality, conflict will arise and anxiety comes in its train at a social level. And Bateson has notions relating to paradox and context. And I won't go into it now, but basically he's suggesting that at the essence of human communication are often paradoxes. So I mentioned earlier the concept of the double bind. There's conflicting advice or instructions you're given by a person in authority, and you can't find a solution. Likewise, there will be experiences in life that are paradoxical, and that can create anxiety and tension. But what metaphor and what art and what literature enable you to do is to navigate your way through those paradoxes. So Russell's theory of logical types, Bateson refers to them because in pure logic, I did a video on logic and paradox. In pure logic, there isn't a proper role for paradox. You have to exclude it. Logical paradoxes exist, but you have to find ways to get rid of them because then you can't think logically. Well, art and literature deal with paradox as part of their natural way of processing our experience of the world. So art and literature help you deal with paradoxical situations because they embody them. Whereas pure logic, pure science, without these countervailing forces, if you live in a society that's dominated by literal thinking, quantitative thinking, that Alberti picture of the geometric spatialization of the world around us, that can create anxiety, that can create schizoid autistic traits. So philosophy or art as the antidote. Just to sum the whole talk up, Aristotle suggested in his Metaphysics that all men by nature desire to know, but the inquiring, questioning philosophical being is, in a crucial dimension, the anxious being. Anxiety, then, rather than being a pathology, is an essential human disposition that leads us to inquire into the great, unsolvable mysteries that confront us. To philosophize is to acknowledge a crucial and animating anxiety that drives inquiry onward. Philosophy itself is an acute expression of our anxiety. I'm anxious, therefore I inquire. Our theories of the world, our illuminations of the unknown, are our antidotes to this anxiety. So that's what I was saying in the previous slide. Blumenberg's notion of the absolutism of reality and the Darwinism of words. The Darwinism of words is that our theories of the world, our illuminations of the unknown, are our antidotes to this anxiety. So Homer's poetry that's been with us since around 600 BC. The book of Genesis, again, similar, maybe 750, 700 BC. These are theories of the world, our illuminations of the unknown. There are antidotes to this anxiety. This anxiety being referred to here is Blumenberg's notion of the absolutism of reality, the reality that confronts us when we come onto the savannah. The things that have stayed with us, the great myths, the great art, the great literature, they're the Darwinism of words. They've been naturally selected. They've survived. And that's what I was saying in the previous slide. Blumenberg's ideas, those two concepts, the absolutism of reality and the Darwinism of words, they are major contributing helpful factors to Bateson's notion of an ecology of mind. How do we orientate ourselves? How do we create a healthy ecology of mind out on the savannah? And that's why I'm linking Blumenberg and people like Bateson, which I'll do much more systematically in future. But this should be reassuring as much as it's puzzling. The idea that you can't, what does it say? To philosophize is to acknowledge a crucial and animating anxiety that drives inquiry onward. Philosophy itself is an acute expression of our anxiety. And I'll just finish with, it's not just philosophy, it's art as well as an acute expression of our anxiety. So to pull all this together, that statement that art or philosophy, I'm adding art, they are an acute expression of our anxiety, and redefining the notion of the monkey mind. The monkey mind just isn't, with respect to Buddhism, I've interpreted it in a different way. The monkey mind isn't just fickleness. It isn't just uncontrolled thoughts. I'm asking you to think of the monkey mind in a slightly different way, as the difficulty we were always bound to have when, as apes, we left the jungle, or we left the Garden of Eden, however you want to think of it, and we confronted the horizon. And that confrontation with the horizon is always going to be a source of anxiety. It can't be escaped. But what art can do is give some form to that, an acute expression of our anxiety. And to that extent, hopefully it's at least somewhat helpful. So I'll finish with a couple of paintings, and I hope you vaguely enjoyed that. Like I say, I'll be coming back to this notion of anxiety and developing these ideas in a lot more detail. So that's given you an overview. So till the next time, all the very best. Take care.